So I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So we will have 3 presentations today, and at the end of the session, we will have I will have a couple questions to every presenter, and we will open the floor for additional questions from the audience. So please welcome my co-presenter, Lauren Clavel, and we will talk about knowledge co-production and lessons from Indigenous communities.
Hello, my name is Lauren Clavel, and as Jen said, I am an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary in the Political Science Department, and I'm of Tahltan descent.
My name is Dr. Jen Sidorova, and I'm a Saha political scientist from Siberia who studies knowledge co-production from policy perspectives. So I would like to start talking a little bit about the Canadian Northern Corridor from knowledge co-production perspectives. The Canadian Northern Corridor idea aims to go over various provinces in the Canadian North and near North, and it would cross the areas mostly classified as treaty land, historical and modern, on which the rights, needs, and priorities of Indigenous and local communities touched by the CNC must be respected and exercised. Indigenous knowledge and wisdom are crucial when it comes to the recognition of Indigenous rights, needs, and priorities. This wisdom includes stories of hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous hunters, fishers, and cattle breeders who truly respect and honor their land. So in this presentation, which will be made in an experimental storytelling format, we'll share the story about how Indigenous knowledge and wisdom about nature was passed to different people and organizations, and what obstacles occurred throughout the way, and what were the ways to pass it with respect, honor, and reciprocity.
So it's important to know that Indigenous ways of life derive from the responsibility from Creator to tend to our societies, as well as the lands, waters, and animals that sustain us. Everything is interconnected. Legal traditions are often reflected in language and substance activities like berry picking or moose hiding. So participation in land-based activities is a great way to learn from communities. Meeting and speaking with elders, knowledge holders, and language speakers is also a key component to learning, as they share stories and wisdom about who we are and where we come from. Stories connect the cause with the outcome and illustrate how everything is interconnected. So engaging with knowledge holders and elders in informal settings like focus groups and sharing circles is a great way to help pass knowledge and wisdom from communities.
So there are many ways to get involved with different people who are interested in Indigenous and local knowledge or are required to include the Indigenous and local knowledge in their reports. So there are people from industry, people from government, and people from academia. Environmental impact assessments are conducted by the industry and the government, and typically they rarely incorporate Indigenous and local knowledge in a meaningful way, because they mostly use formal scientific language, and they also ask people to talk by bullet points instead of asking them to share their stories. Same could apply to other engagement processes associated with the government, such as land claims agreements and co-management regimes. But as we found out, it is possible to involve people from Indigenous communities in a more meaningful way. Like, for example, by organizing collaboration between communities and researchers through community-based environmental monitoring. And we will talk about community-based environmental monitoring later, but first we will share with you what we think is important for meaningful learning about Indigenous wisdom.
So it's important to know that Indigenous political systems are designed to meet the specific needs of each nation. Laws are typically created and enforced in consensual and inclusive manners that are compatible with the respective nation's spiritual, territorial, and economic beliefs. But Indigenous and local knowledge should be taken as expertise and not as culture. So it's critical that all initiatives associated with the Canadian Northern Corridor are long-term commitments to reconciliation that honor Indigenous and local communities' rights, expectations, and priorities. Genuine representation in environmental monitoring recognizes and affirms treaty and Indigenous rights, and this can be achieved through the cultivation of equal partnerships and relationships that are aligned with community values, protocols, and ethics.
Researchers in Indigenous communities in Canada have been involved in community-based environmental monitoring for quite a while. These monitoring programs are run by Indigenous and local community members who gather and oversee impacts of ongoing development. And basically, community members are trained by scientists how to use various sophisticated technological tools to monitor levels of pollution. And also sometimes they measure impacts of any industrial or non-industrial development, like for example, climate change impacts. Like for example, they ask them, what are the actual changes and what are the actual impacts on land, water, and animals? Where do caribou go? Why do they disappear? And then, for example, we looked at Fort McKay community in northern Alberta and how they monitored levels of pollution on bears in this region. So Wood Buffalo Environmental Association, for example, trained community members how to use scientific tools to evaluate impacts of pollution on blueberries, cowberries, and Saskatoon berries. And in a similar way, researchers involved in the Track and Change program asked community members in middle and northern Canada to measure levels of pollution in their water. And at last, scholars asked community members in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador to monitor caribou behavior and migration patterns. So it was a really nice way to partner with Indigenous communities and also to apply for various sources of funding to collaborate.
So all of these stories can serve as examples of what helps to pass wisdom about nature and Indigenous and local knowledge. Each of the projects were Indigenous and community-led. They all employed or incorporated Indigenous teachings in their methodologies, and they were supported by the participating researchers. Community-based environmental monitoring also provided community stewardship over their lands and research methods that were aligned with their own protocols, ethics, and values. And then another successful element was the participation of knowledge holders and elders through land-based teachings and substance activities, like berry picking.
So there are many challenges that unfortunately community-based environmental monitoring programs encountered on their way, but like there's always a space for learning. So we discovered a few. So no laws and regulations in provinces, territories, and in Canada in general allow community-based monitoring programs to function properly. So there is simply no space for them in the Canadian laws. And that's the reason why it makes things more complicated. So these monitoring programs will also require many volunteers. So you have to constantly rely on volunteer help to ask people and then keep them reliable. So that's why the volunteers should be accountable. And also it's important to kind of like cheer them up in order to motivate them to work for the program, to be involved in the program. So they have to be committed to their work. And unfortunately, there is a very high reliance on volunteer help in these monitoring programs. It is also hard to, rely on people if they're busy with their lives, with their schedules, with their other tasks. And also the landscape also matters a lot. Like, for example, if you live near the mountains, your wisdom about this place would be sufficiently different from your friend's knowledge. Like, let's say that your friend lives in a flat area. And that's why landscape is also like other reason why community-based monitoring regimes, like the data from the community-based monitoring regimes would be quite different. So it would be quite challenging to analyze this sort of data. Also, there are no standards or established norms when it comes to data collected by volunteers. And researchers cannot process Indigenous knowledge because it's often incompatible with their education. So their training that they have, and also their own views of nature, because a lot of environmental researchers, they are conservationists, as opposed to sustainable view that Indigenous communities hold. So because of all these reasons, and maybe those we haven't found yet, it's been hard to include Indigenous wisdom about nature and community-based environmental monitoring programs.
And so I just wanted to say on my behalf that I am extremely fortunate to be supported and encouraged by my mother, my grandparents, and my professors to reconnect with my family's community, Tahltan. Without their shared wisdom and guidance, I wouldn't know where I come from or be where I am today. And my connections are just beginning, but it's already been a really fulfilling and meaningful experience that I think that everybody should get to have.
And on my behalf, I just wanted to say that all my life I've been taking Indigenous knowledge and wisdom of Saha people for granted until I listened to Robin Wall Kimmerer's revolutionary book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I think that Indigenous knowledge is not quite research in Siberia in the same way as research in North America and other parts of the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Saha Indigenous knowledge has not been passed from generation to generation, similar to other parts of the world. And I hope in future there will be a separate research program dedicated to study Indigenous knowledge of my people. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. So we will have the floor open for questions at the end of all presentations. And I would like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Jeanette Ferguson, to talk about the usage of Indigenous languages in large-scale infrastructure development.
So good afternoon. Thank you so much to Jen for inviting me to speak at this conference and to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been discussing recently in our own cooperative projects. So I'm joining you here today from Amiskwachi Waskahikan or Edmonton Treaty 6 Territory and Métis Nation Region 4. So I will speak a little bit today about some of the events, I suppose, that led me to becoming more interested in the connection between language and land. I've been doing research in northern regions of the world, starting out with working with speakers in Nunavik in northern Quebec, and also Southern Shoshone speakers in the Yukon early on in my academic career. But for the last 10 or so years, I've been doing research in the Saha Republic, doing work on the language revitalization and maintenance of the Saha language in the urban center of Yakutsk. So originally, a lot of my work was focused as a linguistic anthropologist on doing this work, again, in an urban environment. I did not spend quite as much time considering the more rural areas of the Saha Republic because it was already known that the language Saha was very strong in those spaces, and I was more interested in the shift to an urban environment and how people were working towards cultural and linguistic reclamation in those spaces. But in more recent years, from about 2017, I also had the opportunity to do some work in the Amga and Chirupcha districts of the Saha Republic, and sort of through happenstance, just through other people that I knew, I started getting very interested in local knowledge and environmental knowledge and the connections with language. And I'll share with you perhaps a short anecdote of a moment when I really realized that there was something crucial in terms of the language choice, what language you use to talk about the environment and to talk about ecology. And I was with the woman that you see here on the left wearing the kerchief, Elena Nikolaevna, who is a well-known herbalist in the Amgar region. And she was, we were on a walk this afternoon in a field outside of her hometown, and we were collecting certain herbs that she used for various culinary and healing purposes. And one of the things that she really impressed upon me in our conversations is, as we named the plants that we saw, she told me that it was really, really important for me to know the names in Saha. Knowing the Latin name of the plant was not enough. Knowing the name in Russian or English was not enough. But if you really wanted to understand the landscape and know the landscape, you had to know the name of those plants in Saha. And Saha names for plants fall into a number of different categories, but one of the key traits of a lot of those plant names is that they're highly descriptive. They're descriptive of what the plant looks like so they can be easily located. Other times they give hints to what the plant is used for. In other cases, they also tie to stories and narratives, and I'll get to a few examples of this later on. And so in doing this work, I started to become more interested in the intersections between environmental knowledge and language, and how that was encoded in language. And this has led me to a lot more thinking as I've returned here to work in Canada. So I want to talk a little bit about why language can be important to meaningful engagement with communities, but also why the kinds of approaches we take in meaningful engagement, even in doing environmental surveys and other kinds of work, is also important to broader projects of language sustainability and language security in Indigenous communities. So oftentimes what we find is that there's a kind of default to what is often referred to as a common language. It's simply assumed that if you and the group of people that you work with have a language in common, right, which is usually English or French or Russian, right, we just use that language as default, and that information is information. It can be easily transferred from one language to another, equivalents can be found, and that the integrity of that information is retained. But this is a language ideology or a language attitude or belief that relies on a number of assumptions that don't necessarily pan out. It's of course a legacy of linguistic colonialism and the idea of hegemonic monolingualism, that one language is enough. Every language is just a resource or a tool, and you can swap them out equally, right, and still get the same information, and that all languages are commensurable, that you can find equivalents for every word and every concept in every language, but a lot of that does not pan out. Common language is an interesting term because we all know that even if we technically are all speaking the same language, misunderstandings can still happen. And in work assessing projects dealing with oil and gas in Northern Alberta, Tara Jolie and Clint Westman have noted that a lot of environmental impact assessments often are abandoned because of the falling apart of relationships with Indigenous communities. And often they note that this is due to lack of trust, a heavy focus on Western science, and often just the token inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, and a lack of real integration of Indigenous worldviews and ways of seeing the world. And so I suggest that more researchers, whether you are an academic researcher or you are working in consulting, need to learn Indigenous languages. Obviously, this is going to be on a very case-by-case basis. Some languages, of course, due to documentation and accessibility, are going to be easier to learn than others. Depending on different people's motivation and circumstances, how much they can learn of another language is also going to be highly variable. But what I argue for is that any researcher doing work in Indigenous communities needs a familiarity with the language as much as possible. And that in this way, we can perhaps prevent some of the loss of integrity of some of the traditional ecological knowledge that might be gained. We can stop simply paying lip service to that knowledge, sort of integrating it into reports as an afterthought, but to better make it the foundation of the work through paying attention to language itself. So there's been a lot of work on how land and language are intrinsically connected in Indigenous worldviews. Oftentimes language is seen or viewed as a substance or a property that emerges from the land, and that through connecting with language, people can also connect with the land itself. For linguistic anthropologists, this is often referred to as an eco-linguistic approach, which is seeing language as an integral part of an ecosystem and should be part and parcel of that analysis of environmental discourse. We see that there are, some areas within, public policy in Canada where Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous languages obviously are being incorporated. And we found recently, Jen and I, that the National Energy Board report mentions a key theme in the Cree language, Ikantakaski, which translates to keeping land pure. And while this Energy Board report talks about using a term in Cree to acknowledge a broader Indigenous worldview, we want to, see and follow up with how that's actually been integrated into the practices of the National Energy Board. Are they basing their ideas on this Cree term and everything that Cree term, connotes, or is this simply a way of attempting to translate, a broader Western science into something Cree. So language as an integrated cultural resource, an integrated part of the environment is something that many Indigenous scholars have been speaking about for a long time. Bernard Purley, who is Maliseet from New Brunswick, talks about the fact that language has tangible and intangible properties that also need to be maintained in order for traditional ecological knowledge and cultural knowledge to be preserved and revitalized. And when we pay closer attention to language, we start to get a deeper level of understanding of things like worldview and the ways that worldview and ecological knowledge are, incredibly intertwined. One of the things that I often hear from people who are, perhaps doing research in Indigenous communities, but using a language like English or Russian, is that, well, we need to talk about scientific terms, and the Indigenous language doesn't have a word for, a given scientific term, like language Y does, and often takes, a lot of paraphrasing to capture some of those same concepts. But oftentimes what we find is that in attempting to find complete equivalent, something that means exactly the same thing as environment or exactly the same thing as ecology, you start to miss out on what other words a language might have instead, but also some of the other linguistic features that may connote something integral about the ways that people approach the environment or conceptualize the environment. What we see in a lot of Indigenous language is that an idea of a relational worldview is something that is embedded both within the vocabulary and grammar of a language. Cree, for instance, has a grammatical distinction between what are considered animate and inanimate nouns. This is something like the kinds of noun classes we see in French or Spanish, where you have genders of nouns, but instead in Cree, nouns must take different verb forms depending on whether they're classed as animate or inanimate. And interestingly, a lot of the things that we might see as animate are not marked as animate in Cree, and things that are marked as inanimate might be the opposite. Well, many Cree linguists themselves have stressed that some of this may be arbitrary. Others have also pointed out knowledge from elders that suggests why certain things fall into these categories, which is often due to how they relate to the persistence or provision of life, as well as how they help people survive, falls into the animate category, whereas things that are inanimate are things that are less urgent for survival. In Saha as well, there is no widespread system of grammatical distinction on animacy, but some verbs, for instance, can only be used for subjects viewed as animate or having agency. And many things in the environment, many beings have that agency. Coming back to some of the stories about plant names, one of the plant names I learned that day with Elena Nikolaevna was the word for the plant that we often refer to in the Canadian North as Labrador tea. Sugun abakata is the word, and of course many terminological studies will list Indigenous names for plants and things like that. But they don't go one step deeper into taking apart that word and looking about what that word actually means. And what's really interesting is that sugun is a bilberry. It's the name of another berry. And then abarach is an uncle. So sugun abagata literally means bilberry, it's uncle, which might sound very cute and whimsical, but it actually tells us something about the environment in which those plants live. Bilberries and so sugun and sugun abagata are both found in boggy or swampy areas. The sugun abagata plant grows slightly taller than blueberry bushes, so it's seen as an uncle or older relative of the other, which again shows a relationship and naming plants based on their relationship to each other. We also have cases where entire stories are embedded in words. A plant for one of the pulsatile species, which is what we would call a prairie crocus or a pasque flower here, is kege kukaha, which is cuckoo's ears. And this relates to a story about how creator deities created the cuckoo, but the cuckoo really wanted ears, but didn't get any. And the plant was named after the ears, and both the sound of the cuckoo and these plants arrive at the same time in the spring, which points to a certain calendar that would then remind people that it's, of course, time to do certain activities in the environment. And perhaps most Importantly, one of the things that we miss when we don't pay close attention to language are, again, distinctive concepts that don't have easy translations. For instance, for Cree speakers, the concept of Wakotowin is one of the central sort of I guess we could say guiding concepts for Cree activity and relationality in the world. And oftentimes this term is simply glossed as relationality or kinship. But when we call it relationality or kinship in English, we then often tend to import a lot of those connotations for those words that might not necessarily be the same as in Cree. For instance, when we talk about relatives and kin in English, we often are talking about our human relatives rather than relatives that might be other than human. Wakotowin also is connected to law, as Cree legal scholar Val Napoleon has stressed. And following from that, we need to really focus on the fact that Wakotowin is full of responsibilities and obligations, not just to our human relatives, but to other than human relatives. So when we start to look for the concepts a language does have, rather than trying to find easy substitutes for things like environment or ecology, we start to better understand the kinds of worldviews that exist in those languages. Finally, I want to mention that when we consider better practices surrounding language and engaging with Indigenous languages in this type of work, I want to invoke some of the calls for reconciliation put forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in their report, which had 94 calls to action. And there aren't any particular calls that focus specifically on consultation or research, but some of the ones on language are things that I think can be folded into some of the approaches that we take as researchers. Some of them are directed specifically, of course, towards responsibilities of the federal government. And I want to talk just for a second about number 14, which I've reproduced here. And in point one here, in that, here it says Aboriginal languages are a fundamental and valued element of Canadian culture and society, and there is, an urgency to preserve them. This is something that we can directly address as researchers, either in making the efforts to learn some of these languages ourselves, or supporting the kinds of programs that are already existing in these communities, which is point 4 here. There has been research within linguistic anthropology showing the ways that land and language planning often go hand in hand in Indigenous communities, where reclamation over activities on the land, as well as attempts to create curricula and materials for language revitalization, often go together. And this is seen in a lot of Christine Schreier's work on Loon River Cree and Taku River Tlingit. How a researcher engages with the Indigenous community will depend highly on the needs and preferences of those communities, the status and state of the language in those communities. For instance, speaking of the Corridor Project, we can look at languages like Inuktitut Cree, many of the Dene languages have large numbers of speakers, and that there are resources and opportunities to learn those languages relatively easily. But in situations where researchers may not be able to, approach a conversational level or study the language deeply, this is a time to employ second language learners from those communities to work with fluent first language speakers and act as mediators between researchers who are also hopefully learning some of the language themselves, but also to produce more speakers in that community, which is something that is incredibly important, especially for linguistic communities that don't have a large speaker population. So just to suggest some of the things that both myself and Jen have been thinking of in our work, what would be some possible best practices for researchers or consultants working in these communities, attempting to document, traditional ecological knowledge, encouraging speakers to use Indigenous languages for initial documentation and information is really important. Too often, the default to English happens because of an assumed belief that that is the only language that outsiders will engage in. And making the effort to learn and learning, as much as you possibly can. Again, that will vary depending on circumstance. Even some basic comprehension and understanding of a grammatical structure can go a long way to maintaining the integrity of data, but also in showing respect and accommodation to the community. And this better allows us again, many examples we could talk about. But when we focus on the language itself, what can we integrate into the basis of the study in terms of Indigenous worldviews, rather than adding these as an afterthought or something that we don't base our reports on. But this also contributes, right, to helping learners and bilingual speakers in the community keep their languages going, contributing and helping in ways that we might be able to, even if it just involves recording speakers and passing on those recordings to the community, are ways that we can really help strengthen and work toward the security of Indigenous languages, as well as going deeper into these kinds of ontologies and understandings that are, I would say, incredibly vital when taking on projects that look at environmental impact in communities. So thank you very much. And again, thank you again for the invitation to speak here. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Okay, so I would thank you so much, Janine, for presenting a wonderful presentation. And I would just like to ask our third speaker, Whitney, if he's here, because I don't see his name in the participant list. So he's experiencing some issues, and he will join us a little bit later. So that's why I would like to open the floor for questions right now. So I have a couple questions for every presenter. And I would like to ask my co-presenter, Lauren, first. So Lauren, I know that you're a student in political science, and you already took some very interesting courses from our Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. So in this regard, how do you think political science field would contribute to the study of knowledge co-production? So as an Indigenous scholar, how do you see the role of political science? So how can political science discipline enhance knowledge co-production process, like the studies on knowledge co-production?
Well, I think, like, first and foremost, it's really important to challenge the Western, like, dominant thought as well as, like, processes, and understanding, like, why do we take these things for granted? How did these systems start, and how are they normalized, I think, is a really great way. So just, like, understanding, like, the current political system, and then also understanding that there are so many different political theories and governance structures in the world, and so what really is another one to study and to understand and to engage with. And I think also, just because the social science, like political science, is a social science as well, so it does have that ability to contribute, and it should contribute to the co-production by broadening its methodological approaches and not only incorporating the ones that are a little bit more scientifically aligned, I think. And then other than that, I think because a lot of the legal traditions in Indigenous communities and nations are related to political systems, it is helpful to study the connections between governance systems as well as ways of life, because in Indigenous communities and culture, everything is interconnected. So it's important to have a broad, full circle understanding of everything. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I have a couple questions to Janine. So Janine, do you find any similarities? You said that you studied multiple Indigenous communities across the Arctic, like including Saha community. So do you find any similarities in Indigenous worldviews across the Arctic region, particularly in communities that you studied? And so what do you think about it?
Well, there's a couple of different spaces in which I see a lot of key parallels. Obviously, the connection between land and language is something that arises in many Indigenous communities around the world, not just northern ones. There are a lot of similar spiritual beliefs as well that surround language. As linguistic anthropologists, we often refer to these as language ideologies or language ontologies, which are the beliefs and attitudes about what language is in the world, right? And in a Western scientific context, we often, again, we see language as a tool, right? It's a tool for communication. It conveys knowledge from one person to another person. But different cultures around the world have different conceptions about what language is. And one of the things that I have found particularly striking, for instance, between Saha speakers as well as Cree speakers, as a student of Cree right now, is that language itself is seen as something that is sacred and has spiritual force. And the fact that, speaking a language on the land allows you to connect with certain beings, right? Whether that's with animals or with spirits. And that is something that also we need to consider, is that the act of speaking the language, right, what linguistic anthropologists simply refer to as a speech act. Again, the choice of which language you use to engage with an animal or a human or another being is really important. And so the sacredness of language is something that pops up a lot when we talk about attitudes and beliefs about language. And it's been really interesting to hear from Cree teachers like Belinda Daniels, for instance, who is a professor at the University of Victoria, talking about the idea of the spirit of language in Cree, and then hearing, Saha interlocutors talking about, Tul language being ichilech or animate or spirited as well. So that's a common thing I see. And then, of course, then just looking at words and naming, the ways that naming is often something that, again, embeds certain kinds of relationships. Naming embeds, again, spiritual belief. Naming embeds entire stories and narratives that tell us something about how people interact with the environment. And so, simply recording terminology can be really important, right? But going deeper into that terminology and understanding the stories behind it, the connotations, all of that is something that I found, really illuminating, both in working in the Saha Republic and now as a learner of Cree here in Northern Alberta, has been really fascinating to me. So yes, I would say overall these connections with land and this sort of triangular notion of land, language, and spirituality is something that is common in Northern and other Indigenous communities in multiple locations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeanette. So we have Whitney, who has joined the session.
Great.
But
really happy to be rejoining this wonderful conference and to speak a bit about probably my favorite topic in the world, the Canadian Rangers, as the eyes, ears, and voice of the Canadian Armed Forces in the North, but hopefully glean some broader insights into Indigenous engagement and knowledge co-production as per the spirit of this session, and then hopefully get into some of these rich conversations about place names and power and so on, which would be really fascinating here. So I've been looking and exploring and I guess enamored with the Canadian Rangers for almost a quarter century now, which dates me. First came to encounter the Canadian Rangers as an undergraduate co-op student, working through a history program and helping to organize an Indigenous Awareness Week display in Ottawa in 1996, and having this group of individuals from Northern Canada, who I eventually learned were Inuit, showing up, building a styrofoam igloo or snow house. Igloo just means any dwelling in Inuktitut, but a snow house out of styrofoam, and then wearing these red hoodies and then describing what they did in this organization as members of the Canadian military in a form of service unlike anything that I had ever heard of or seen before. And in the past, I've described it in writings as being a postmodern military organization. I'm not sure that that's really the right descriptor for it. But an organization that was created in 1947, and the first unit stood up in May of that year. So it's right now just celebrating its 75th anniversary, and the Canadian House of Commons has recently declared the rest of 2022 to be the year of the Ranger, as this very unorthodox way of dealing with Canada's need to both have a military presence in the North, but ensure that that's not disproportionate to the threat environment in the region, and that it's attuned where possible to the needs of Northern community members. So again, I'm going to take you through a bit of a foray here of history because I think it's relevant. The first is a quote from 1947, and it's a military official saying, what we don't need and what we don't want are just simply taking the ways that we have military forces in Southern Canada and going and thinking that we need to have the same thing in the North. What we need are specially adapted people who live in the North, who live in remote regions, who want to share that knowledge and what skills they have with Canada as a whole. But if we try and make them too military, we're going to lose by it. So I love it. Very prescient by Colonel Keane back in July of 1947, trying to say, if we're going to build something in the North, it's got to look different than it does elsewhere in Canada. So the Rangers adopted a series of roles that are quite different than other elements of the Canadian Armed Forces. provide guides to organized troops who are operating within the area that they live in, to watch the coastlines, be eyes and ears. At that time, it was assist the police in discovering, reporting, and apprehending enemy agents or saboteurs, reporting other suspicious activities, providing local defenses against sabotage, and then reporting, locating rescue work, including first aid in connection with an aircraft that went down. In peacetime, providing training, preparing local defense schemes, collecting detailed information on their local area. The whole key here being Rangers as a form of service, highly localized, focused on people knowing their home community and being present in their homeland. This meant that individuals like the late Alex Van Bibber, who served in the Rangers for more than 6 decades, Métis First Nation man from the southern Yukon, right, talks about in the early 1940s being very low-keyed, very local, and Rangers not given a lot of direction, to the 1950s being more actively involved in supporting forces from elsewhere coming up into the homeland, recognizing the value that these Rangers played as local members of their community with very little training in simply having expertise born of their local and Indigenous knowledge, and getting involved in some of the military exercises designed to showcase a military presence in the North. And really coming into this eyes and ears type role insofar as communications allowed for what the Rangers saw to be communicated to headquarters down south. But this changed in the late 1950s. We got caught up with technology and trying to geoengineer solutions to continental defense, building the distant early warning line of radars along the 70th parallel to give advanced warning of a potential fleet of Soviet bombers coming over to bomb the industrial and political heartland of North America. In this context, it seemed like there was a lack of interest in investing in human sensors, individuals with minimal training who lived in a region and were just expected to detect anomalies. So much so that by 1970, you had officials going up and saying, look, the North has changed, and so have Northerners. Bill Sterling suggesting that hunting and trapping are no longer the main pursuits of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have been educated through tragedies like residential schools, right? Trying to deny them of their cultural knowledge. He said they've all moved into cities now. They no longer live out on the trap line dispersed throughout the North. The type of people that we wanted to bring into the Rangers back in the 1940s no longer exist because the North has become modernized. I find this fascinating. This is somebody talking about things 50 years ago that we still hear echoes of, sadly, in the 2020s. Others, though, were more astute. They said, no, the issue here and why the Rangers have a lot of activity by 1970 is because of a lack of trust, right? We have a military, we have government of Canada that tends to make a whole bunch of plans and promises, but then cancels those plans without telling anybody or loses interest and never providing follow-up support. So the argument being, if the Rangers aren't functional, it's because they've been left to wither on the vine for 15 years. The military was also very clever too, coming in and suggesting that actually there's also a crisis of leadership and legitimacy. If the Rangers are going to be based in individual communities, why should the military be selecting who should be appointed to lead them in their community-based units? So the military did something very different. It turned around in the 1970s and suggested that Rangers within their local units should elect their own local leadership. This was very progressive. I see this like this was anticipating self-government and forms of self-determination under the auspices of the Canadian state. What the suggestion was is, why would First Nation, Inuit, or Métis leaders simply accept the imposition of external leadership according to criteria that don't matter to them at the community level? What about if local members were able to identify what form of leadership was most meaningful to them given the needs of their community? And also a real dramatic investment in the Rangers as an appropriate form of service for Northerners by not asking the most educated, the best, the brightest, according to Southern criteria, to go and pick up and join the military down south, be trained and standardized to be like everybody else in the Canadian Armed Forces to fight overseas. Why not ensure that Northern leadership remain in the home communities and still be able to serve Canada? I think it was a pretty brilliant concept. Great mutual learning, cooperation is animating the spirit of the force. Partly, I would argue, because it didn't have a lot of funding. Things had to be done at a very grassroots level. And it was the human relationships between the Rangers and other soldiers who came up to train with them, or to work with them on exercises, who forged deep bonds, rooted in mutual trust and, most importantly, mutual respect. So this meant that by the mid-1980s, when Canada began to more strongly articulate its sovereignty position and root this in Inuit use and occupancy of the ice and of the land, and committing to making sure that we were stewards of those sovereign responsibilities within these straight baselines that enclosed all of the Arctic islands, much of what is now described as Inuit Nunangat, or the Inuit homeland within Canada, right, that it was going to be natural to turn to the Rangers to be the military presence, or the most formal, persistent military presence in these regions. So the Rangers grew incredibly in numbers in the late 1980s and 1990s, so that they soon had units in every community within Inuit Nunangat, and also began to extend into the southern parts of the Yukon and Northwest Territories as well. The map you see here just does an arbitrary 200-kilometer range around the communities, suggesting that actually Canada's military, by virtue of the Rangers, had quite a bit of coverage by the turn of the new millennium. And the Rangers really began to draw national attention for the first time, being asked to be primary representatives at the creation of Canada's newest territory of Nunavut in April of 1999, to ask a youth program associated with the Rangers, the Junior Canadian Rangers, to unveil the Nunavut flag, as you see here in the photo. So the Rangers have this role, mission, and tasks that talks about supporting sovereignty operations, which is a rather ambiguous term that we can talk about later if you're interested, but basically to represent a presence, and then to also help and assist with Canadian Armed Forces domestic operations. And it's really interesting that in a lot of the Army's literature, it talks about the Canadian Rangers, which is predominantly an Indigenous force, overwhelmingly comprised of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis members in the Canadian North, outside of the major urban areas, is considered a mature capability compared to conventional regular force and primary reserve, or like militia, part-time soldier elements based in southern Canada. It's a recognition that Northerners, even if they're only lightly trained, are really the subject matter experts in the North. The role, missions, and tasks has also matured over time. It's no longer about having the Rangers assisting in local defense against enemies who might come in some kind of combat role, recognizing they're not trained for it. And Canada's Arctic threat environment doesn't warrant this need. If there is some kind of foreign military incursion in our north, we have capabilities in the south that can come up north to deal with them, and they'll be supported by the Rangers. It's not about Rangers assisting police in apprehending enemy agents or in aiding the civil power. The latter one is especially to ensure that Rangers are not put in a position where they're being called upon to go and, say, take down a blockade that's maybe been erected by their very family members in their communities. It's recognizing how closely they are their communities. But I love to celebrate the Rangers as first responders, that because they're trained and provided supports from the Canadian military, they're actually really well prepared to assist their communities in times of crisis, during a disaster, an emergency, or a health crisis like we saw during COVID-19. They provide surveillance and liaison functions in the region, making sure that when the military is interacting with communities, it's doing so in a culturally responsible and respectful manner. That militaries are coming north, that their footprint on the north is not having a negative impact on communities or on their environment, and also a very useful form of human surveillance. They're human sensors. Who better to detect whether something is out of the ordinary, whether something is an anomaly in their homeland, than people who actually live there all the time? They're a reassurance that even in this age of us focusing on deploying these sensor systems that I talked about in my last brief, right, this integrated layered defense, that we not forget that humans are incredibly adaptable surveillance and sensor systems. Rangers are a very positive bridge, and as Canada's 2019 Northern Strategy emphasized, the Rangers are a very important presence in the North. There's a lot of support from Northerners in the Rangers and in their training and effectiveness. I just wrapped up appearing before a House of Commons committee on emergency preparedness in the North, and all of the questions that came from Lori Idlout, the NDP member of Parliament from Nunavut, related to the Rangers. And we're all about figuring out ways that there can be more funding and more support to what she identifies, as do most Northerners, as a very positive military footprint in Northern communities, and a form of very healthy collaboration between the military, who obviously, as like the classic appendage of the colonial state, are often cast as being inherently threatening to Indigenous peoples or colonized peoples. In this case, there's another dynamic going on through the Rangers that I'd be happy to chat about that's rather different than what our theories would have us anticipate. The Rangers ensure that when the military in Canada talks about a military presence, it refers to Indigenous communities as the heart of Canada's North and emphasizes the importance of expanding and deepening relationships with the communities, recognizing that these are relationships that already exist by virtue of the Canadian Rangers and this youth program, the Junior Rangers, that I mentioned before. They're a very, in my mind, appropriate form of cultural awareness, local expertise being integrated into military systems, but in a way that does not try to deny that local subject matter expertise and empowerment and knowledge from being rooted in the communities and rooted in individual cultures. It's not about acculturating these members of communities to become like other elements of the military, but to let them have relationships to interact effectively with the military on terms negotiated largely on the conditions of the Rangers in ways that fit with their ways of knowing and being. So I emphasized before the voice component that I love to add on to this eyes and ears of the Canadian North descriptor usually given to the Rangers. It's because they're very important as being a voice within the Canadian military system of ensuring that First Nations, Métis, Inuit priorities are also reflected in the way that the military does business and serve as a way of really grounding military activities in communities in a healthy and responsive way. So I'm not going to get into details, but one of the ways that I really have come to appreciate the Rangers is with my colleague, Dr. Peter Kickert of St. Francis Xavier University, talking about resilience and a much broader concept then that relates to a lot of our discussions about infrastructure and security. The capacity to cope with stresses and shocks by responding and reorganizing in ways that you don't lose touch with your essential identity or function or structures, but allow you to bounce forward in ways that may require changing and adapting to conditions that are shifting. Key factors: self-organization to make decisions and implement responses, being inclusive of diverse responses, learning from and integrating different types of knowledge, and being able to navigate surprise and uncertainty. And I think these are actually factors that help to explain why the Rangers is so successful. How investing in community level skills and knowledge and reinforcing what's already known in the communities helps to bolster community disaster resilience. So how communities are able to respond and eventually recover from humanitarian or environmental disasters locally. And while a lot of our conversations focus on whether or not the Canadian military or other national militaries need to be pre-positioning more aircraft in the north or investing in more naval capabilities or Coast Guard capabilities to respond to search and rescue or a mass rescue operation, the Rangers sort of remind us, what about thinking about investing in those local communities and those people who reside in the community at all times to being able to be those first responders? What about community resilience more broadly, and how investing in Northern peoples through organizations like the Rangers provides transferable skills that not only, yes, serve the Canadian state and serve the Canadian military, but also allow the communities themselves to prepare for and strengthen their sense of security and their sense of safety. Also, I've done quite a bit of work looking at the Rangers through the concept of Indigenous resilience. So measuring the success of the Rangers through Inuit social values and Inuit Kaujamajutukanjit or IQ principles, and also Dene values in a First Nations context, to being able to understand how an organization like this has a logic that fits within core values, societal values of First Peoples. And then also thinking about how the Rangers reinforce individual resilience. So an individual sense of ability to withstand shocks and so on. And for this, working through Arctic social indicators developed by the Arctic Human Development Report Initiative, looking at how the Rangers can contribute to health by encouraging people to be out on the land. How even modest forms of pay and payment for use of personal equipment contributes to material well-being. How it represents a form of lifelong learning and education, but not education based in classrooms, most of it actually being based on the land, how it contributes to a sense of cultural well-being, cultural vitality, a feeling of the value of those cultural skills and attributes and identities that people have, and how these actually are valued both within the culture, but also have salience and relevance beyond that culture, promoting contact with the environment, and also providing a really strong sense of fate control, which is a really important dynamic that I think is hard sometimes for us as social scientists to go engage, but people feeling like they're in control of their own destiny being so important to mental health, well-being. So big takeaways here is my work on the Canadian Armed Forces and communities in the North really tries to promote a shift in thinking. Often when we talk about security, we think about insecurity, we think about vulnerabilities, we think about weaknesses, we think about lack of capacity or lack of competency in certain segments of the North. I think part of it is also though overcoming this deficit mindset. It's actually being more positive in looking at what the North brings in terms of equities, capabilities, skills, knowledge, ways of being to the whole security equation. And in order to have a better sense of this, a lot of opportunity for capacity mapping, coordination of efforts, and empowerment of people at a community level to be able to serve these agendas. Also seeing how it's the non-security aspects in the classic sense of organizations like the Rangers contributing to the transgenerational transfer of knowledge within their cultures that really forms a very positive community building, and I'd say by extension then, healthy, inclusive nation building enterprise like the Rangers. And how it doesn't force Northern peoples like my friend Emmanuel Adam here from Tuktoyaktuk, the Master Corporal there, to have to choose between Indigenous identities and those of being a Canadian citizen, which are often theoretical tensions or conflicts that we as academics impose on ways of understanding how people are within their respective states. And I think this is really important where we can look to guidance from the Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty in the Arctic and other documents to think about the myriad ways that Inuit identify as people, as citizens of states, and as Indigenous peoples, and how they confer rights from those many different forms of identity that they have. And that actually putting them as if they're binary equations of one or the other can actually limit their ability to navigate constructively within the world. So some of the research I'm doing now is clarifying the practical roles that the Rangers and other community-based organizations play in emergency disaster response, search and rescue, safety, and how we can better coordinate training opportunities and improve their operational effectiveness. So getting down to communities, listening to community members, and figuring out ways that we can help them to create synergies and to better do what they're already doing. And then very much looking to ways of advancing the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee work in Canada and its new agenda relating to defense, security, and safety, which provides a lot of political impetus to learn from examples like the Rangers. So final thing here is to take it in a very interesting direction. But when the Inuit Circumpolar Council released its Circumpolar Inuit Protocols on Equitable and Ethical Engagement last week, I thought immediately that this actually is an interesting way that I'll have to apply to thinking about why the Rangers works or why it succeeded in Inuit communities. It does reflect the spirit of nothing about us without us, the need to always engage with Inuit when doing things or thinking about understanding things within Inuit Nunangat. The Rangers are that at a core. They're rooted in those communities. They're rooted in the people. They recognize Indigenous knowledge in its own right. It's not whether it's validated by Western science that makes it good. I've been out on the land. I've seen what happens when you're white and the GPS runs out of batteries. And Inuit have that ability to navigate home safely because of knowledge that is incredible and rooted in a knowledge of a homeland. Practice of good governance. I think it's there in terms of election of local leadership and relationships. Communicating with intent, being sure that we're very clear and transparent in what we're seeking, and building trust foremost. That means accountability, but everything is rooted in trust, long-standing trust. And if you have that trust, you can overcome the short-term hiccups. Build meaningful partnerships, and partnerships being meaningful to all the different partners involved. So why the Rangers work, it's relevant to communities, it's relevant to individuals in the Rangers, and it's relevant to the military. And by having that synergy, by having that synchronization, it gives it meaning, it's given it stability. It's sharing information, sharing ownership of information, and ensuring that there are permissions that are in place for those of us using information shared to us by knowledge keepers in the North, that it's done on terms that are transparent, that are ethical, and that respect that they are truly the subject matter experts. And then the last part, figuring out how we fund representation and knowledge, and rangers being a mechanism for doing that. Interesting as well that in the ICC process, communities flag several issues, and I think these might be interesting for us to discuss given the spirit of this panel, right? That non-Inuit often lack the knowledge or disregard the complexity of Inuit knowledge. What are our preconceived notions of what Inuit knowledge looks like or should look like? Are we supporting Inuit who want to be involved in decision-making at the right scale with the right supports? Are we providing enough information in advance of meetings and consultations to ensure that the people we're inviting to the table are able to enter into a meaningful dialogue on terms that are relevant to them? Are we conscious of research fatigue at the community level, where if we're going and asking the same questions as 5 generations of researchers have before us, we're perhaps wasting people's time and actually sapping the energy from the community? Are we investing in community-based knowledge management? Are we funding Indigenous knowledge research and Indigenous knowledge holders in planning and implementation of our projects, not just after we've created the project or after we're seeking to validate our results, but throughout the process? And then making sure that at the end of the day, we credit communities and individuals. So leaving off there, I hope I've made some kind of sense. I probably skipped a whole bunch of things I should have mentioned, but I want to suggest that if I know anything about the Rangers, it's because I've been a good listener, and I've had the best subject matter experts who have patiently taught me over the last 25 years what real grounded expertise looks like, what real leadership looks like, what meaningful knowledge looks like. And it quite frankly resides with people like Roger Hickaluk from Kugluktuk, with Debbie Ikaluk, who you see in the top center from Resolute Bay, Debbie Simon from Fort Res in the Northwest Territories, John Mitchell, bottom right corner from Dawson City, Yukon, and then bottom center from Mitsimatalik, my wonderful mentor, Sergeant Titus Alulu.
Thank you so much, Whitney, for the excellent presentation. So as a discussant, I prepared a couple questions to you. And my first question to you would be, do you see potential in collaboration between the Canadian Rangers and police troops in other circumpolar regions, like Alaska, like, for example, military workshops and trainings?
Thanks, Evgenia. So there's certainly a lot of interest. I was in Greenland, I was in Nuuk back in March, and I was asked to appear before their constitutional commission, which is sort of drafting what their constitution may look like in the future. They had lots of questions for me about the Canadian Rangers as a potential model of service for Greenlanders that's different from the existing defense arrangement in Greenland, built around Danish defense and the Sirius Patrol, which I could talk about, Danish special forces who operate by dog team up the East Coast and around the north of Greenland. Same thing from the Alaskans. A lot of interest in potentially looking at the Rangers as a model for reinvigorating opportunities for Northern Alaskans, particularly Indigenous Alaskans, Alaskan Natives, for those of you Americans, right, in serving in American armed forces without having to go and join a National Guard to be trained like everybody else and prepared to go overseas. So a differentiated form of service that's different. So quite a bit of interest from Canada's 2 neighbors. And I think from that, opportunities to also work with the militaries more generally from those countries. One of the tricks is Canadian Rangers, I think appropriately, are intended to serve in Canada, and even more appropriately, intended to serve in their home regions, in their homelands. So there's benefits, of course, of going outside of our homeland, outside of our area of residence to learn from other people, to learn some best practices or to get ideas. But the key is not to think of the Rangers as an element of our military that would go and do things in other parts of the Circumpolar North. They're very much intended to serve their communities, to serve our military in a very localized way, and definitely are not an offensive force. So I laugh when I read some Russian newspapers talking about Canada has an armed force of 5,000 Rangers that we need, in Russia, needs to build up its Arctic defenses to defend against. So that's certainly not what the Rangers are, and certainly not their capability. But they do form as an important and I think very proportionate way of serving.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And the second question would be about the languages. So since we talked a lot about the importance of using Indigenous languages, I would like to ask you if you know, like, how does fluency in Indigenous languages in Canadian North, like Inuktitut and Athabascan languages, influence the Canadian Rangers' work?
Thank you. Fantastic question. One of the most transformative experiences in my life was actually in Nunavik in northern Quebec in the community of Inukjuak. And spending, when I was early in my career, much younger than I am now, spending time on the land over a few days on an exercise in a tent with 3 Inuits, all of whom are unilingual Inuktitut speakers, or were. One of them has passed away. And being in that tent and realizing, yes, the functions of that patrol were in Inuktitut. For the young members of the patrol who had been largely educated in English and French, a lot of the activities on the land were some of the elder rangers speaking with them in Inuktitut very patiently, working with them, and the land being ways of knowing and being on the land, and the actual language itself being so inextricably imbricated, intertwined, meaning that was the appropriate place to be teaching it, not in a classroom. Was marvelous for me to see early on. Since that time, I've often seen the need for ranger instructors. So these are sort of full-time soldiers who go up and train the rangers, but always say that as much as they train the rangers train them. The learning and explaining goes both ways. But their need for patience to both explain things, respecting the fact that for a lot of rangers, English or French is not their first language. So even though they speak English a heck of a lot better than I speak Inuktitut, then I need to slow down, or ranger instructors need to slow down, think about how they're communicating in the form of respect, but also ensure that there's time given for translation, for simultaneous interpretation, for making sure that even though that means that things take longer, and you can tell with the pace at which I talk, my velocity of speaking, it's certainly in a professorial hat, right? I don't come off as the most patient person. When I'm in northern communities, when I'm talking with people and having conversations with people, and mostly listening, I have a very different pace. And I think the success for the Rangers is really respecting that language piece. More perhaps, Evgenia, to your question, it's also seeing the Rangers, and when they're operating on the land, how frequently, and when they're making decisions about where to go on the land. When I'm up observing, or I'm watching ranger instructor sort of ask them a question, a lot of the conversation will actually take place amongst rangers in Inuktitut or Inuinaktun or Inuvialuktun or in the Clichon language or whatever else. So in essence, they are really managing a lot of the information themselves through their language in a way that doesn't put anybody off. It's actually respected. Like, at the end of the day, it is their patrol. They're going to make the right decisions of knowing where it's safe to travel or when to travel or where to go. So in essence, if that's best done with them being able to focus on themselves and not having the halunata, if I'm speaking from how an Inuit might view me, right, lens of saying without me needing to be part of that conversation. So I see it as a form of empowerment as well, and a form of fate control, that this is actually respected and embraced.
Thank you, Whitney. And I would like to address some questions from the chat. Sorry for taking a long time to address them. So the first question is from Belle, and she's basically asking everyone on the panel, in your view, what are the main challenges in knowledge co-production when we often find significant disparities in power between groups, as well as often radically different worldviews? Can they be overcome, and how?
So I think that for me, one of the challenges that I've noticed in terms of co-production and power dynamics has been the creation of us and them narratives, particularly and like historically civilized and uncivilized narratives, but more recently in the categorization of what is and is not knowledge. And so while I can't really comment on when overcoming such power disparities is going to be possible, I can say that it does really require a commitment to challenging our preconceived notions of other groups and their knowledge systems, which requires us to be patient, to challenge the dominant worldviews that we take for granted, as well as providing ethical spaces for growth and change, especially within communities. So when researchers or other professionals are dealing with significant power disparities between groups, I think it's essential that any sort of cooperation or engagement is not only going to recognize and affirm the rights of the non-dominant groups, but it's also going to support and encourage the self-determinance and governance of Indigenous groups as well. So decolonizing our approaches and reconciling with our colonial history is a very important step to overcoming boundaries. But I think that it's more important that Indigenous communities are not only leading in the co-production of their own knowledge, but they're also equal participations in the creation of any laws or policies concerning their existence. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. I really like your answer. And I also wanted to add that from the community-based environmental monitoring programs, what we studied that those programs that were specifically led by Indigenous communities and also where Indigenous communities had enough funding from federal, provincial, and territorial governments, these particular programs succeeded the most in terms of knowledge co-production. So Indigenous leadership and capacity building in Indigenous communities is key to knowledge co-production. And that's actually the way to address power disparities in knowledge co-production, I think. So any other opinions about it?
I think, and thank you so much, Whitney and Lauren, for your comments. I know, as Whitney mentioned, there often are these barriers, especially for beginning researchers, to create these projects, because real co-creation is a long and fraught process, and that it can't always happen, in a couple months or something. And that, having worked with Saha speakers for, since 2009, I'm at a place where, these things come together in much more organic ways because of the people that I know and the people that I work with and past experiences. But it can be really, really hard to start out that way. But I guess in like my current position, and I'm mentoring a lot of undergraduate students in honors, is that, approaching a community, or, in many cases, students working with the communities they're already a part of, encouraging our northern students to work within their own communities can be a way, I think, training more young Indigenous researchers who already have connections to these communities, who, again, they might be approaching these communities as researchers, but, supporting them to come up with their questions and to try and work in ways that they're already embedded in those communities can sometimes be a way. And who does the research is important too. And that, it might be more appropriate in some cases as professors not to do the research ourselves, or maybe take a back seat in the research, but push our students to reconnect with their communities in ways that are appropriate due to the kind of relationality they already have in those communities. And that can sometimes be a way of, I guess, I don't want to say jumpstarting, because I think these relationships always take time, but in maybe renegotiating some of the different dynamics of how this research can take place, and to let people who take on these roles already as community member and as researcher, be able to, find a niche and find a space where they can do both, and maybe play the role of that mediator from the beginning.
Thank you, Whitney. So we had another question, but Janan already addressed to Janan. But hey, thank you, Janan. And we're close to the end of our panel. And I would like to thank every panelist on my session for having time, for taking your time to participate and present your work.